Okay, so I'm just going to do a short little quick review of those 4 jobs that we were talking about in the West: mining, farming, ranching, and railroads. I'm just going to breeze through those really quickly since you got more of an in-depth overview when you were doing your little mini research project. So first we'll just briefly talk about mining. So obviously mining is going to be a national thing. We mine in California, Colorado, gold mines. We have mining closer towards the east, coal mines and things like that. So this is really all over the place. Most miners live in settled communities. And so it sort of helps to sprout up smaller towns further west because more people will move there and open up businesses where the miners will be consumers and sort of start to see these small little almost like Old West towns, like what you would imagine like a stereotypical town in the Old West to be like, is sort of what a mining town was. They didn't really have, once you get really far west and you're really away from everything, the town is really the only thing for hundreds of miles. And so they didn't really have a system of like law and order, which is where we get that idea of the like, stereotypical, rough and tumble type of situation going on in one of those Old West towns. There would be people called vigilantes. Vigilantes would sort of, like take the law into their own hands, so to speak. So like, for some reason, the only example I can think of a vigilante right now is like Spider-Man or Batman. Those are both vigilantes, people not appointed by the government who are carrying out justice, so to speak, in their own mind. But that's basically what that was. We've got some big mining companies that control like coal mining, but gold mining for the most part was like on a little bit of a smaller scale. But mining is fueling a lot of this industrialization that we're having because a lot of it is important for the growth of factories and industries. Railroading, obviously going to be very important in terms of opening up the West. We want that transcontinental railroad, that link between East and West. So we've got the government handing over land grants to our 2 major railroad companies, and they are the Central Pacific Railroad Company and the Union Pacific Railroad Company. So basically these 2 companies in 1863 just start racing to the other end of the country, both trying to move east or west. So like the Central Pacific Railroad Company started in California and was moving east, and then the Union Pacific Railroad Company was starting in Nebraska and they're moving west. So both of these tasks are really difficult. Making this happen is very hard. So it takes quite a while. They are struggling to find people to work the railroads, and that's when immigrants become very, very involved in the railroad construction. For the companies based in California, a lot of what they're hiring are Asian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, and a lot of the immigrants working for the Eastern Nebraska-based railroad company are Irish immigrants. But we've also got white Americans, we've got Native Americans. In the South, we've talked before about they were using prison labor because they didn't have as much money, but they were basically doing the best that they could to get to the other side. Sorry. So they lived a more nomadic style because they're constantly moving. They would set up towns for a brief period of time, and then as soon as the entire thing, as soon as that section of track was complete, they would throw the whole town away, abandon the town, and move several hundred miles up and just, do the next one. So finally in 1869, our railroads come together in Utah, and they like symbolically put in a gold spike as sort of to mark that it's final and complete. But they obviously have taken that out. You are not going to be able to go find that spike. It's in a museum somewhere. But so now we finally have railroads, which is going to be important in terms of expanding the West, not only in population, but also in economics. So ranchers are focusing on cattle, right? Cattle ranching fuels a major westward boom because there are such large open areas of land out west. That's a good place for cattle. So we start this open range system where property is not fenced in, and ranchers just sort of like claim ownership of where they know where their boundaries are. And then if the cattle can, goes across your border, whatever, like nobody really cared. If it was like feeding somewhere else, it was just whatever it was. Nobody really like cared that much about it. It was just sort of like a free for all. But as time goes on and more people start getting involved, then they had to start like actually fencing in their borders. And a lot of Mexican immigrants were coming into the United States and getting involved in ranching, and they were using borders. So eventually we will abandon our open range system. So a cattle drive, have you ever heard of a cattle drive? Obviously at this time you can't put cattle on a car. You can't roll them onto the back of a truck. Very difficult to get them onto a train to move them. So really the only thing that you could do when you want to move your cattle is walk them. So they would, that's called driving the cattle. So they would physically walk herds of cattle to another place where they're there to be sold or whatever. So that's where all of our, like famous Old West cowboys and stuff come from, like Wyatt Earp. I'm pretty sure Wyatt Earp is a movie on your movie list this unit. Jesse James, people like that. That's like where they became famous for. So it wasn't just white guys that were cowboys. There were black cowboys and Mexican cowboys and Native American cowboys all over the place. So by the mid 1880s is when we're stopping that open range system, and things start to become a little bit more organized. So in terms of farming, we've talked about farming a lot. That's really the easiest job to do, not because it's easy, but because there's sort of more, it's more available. It's like in terms of opportunity, you have more opportunity to be a farmer than you do maybe to do some of these other things. So a lot of people, because of the Homestead Act, if you remember us talking about the Homestead Act last semester, where we were giving away, like a 160-acre plot of land to anyone who would just basically be a farmer there, and you can have it for free. Because of that, we've got lots of farming happening. We've even got a lot of African Americans who are moving out west to try and plant crops, and found like all black towns. These are called exodusters. So they're leaving the South, moving west, and trying to develop like African American communities in the West, but they don't really last very long. There are a lot of challenges to farming out west. The soil itself isn't as fertile. The environment isn't as friendly to farming out west as it is in the South. So they experience a lot more difficulties that in Oklahoma and Nebraska and Kansas than they do trying to be a farmer in Georgia or South Carolina. So it's sort of a give and take. But we'll talk about farming a lot more when we get to Unit 3 and the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. So all of these for jobs, it have fair amounts of discrimination. Like I said, with the hiring the Chinese immigrants on the railroad, that's when we start, discriminating against the Chinese. That's when Angel Island starts cracking down on the immigrants coming in on the West Coast. That's when we start passing the Chinese Exclusion Act, because we've got so many coming in to take railroad jobs. There's always, at this point, racism everywhere, right? You can just assume that everybody pretty much at this point, for the most part, is racist, and there's discrimination all over the place. So we've got Mexicans who are having land taken away from them, Mexican Americans who are having land taken away from them in the United States and given to white settlers to use as farming or cattle or whatever. We're continuously taking away land from Native Americans to give to white settlers for using whatever we want to. So that just is just constantly continuing. But because of all of this, pushing people to continue to move west and settle all of this land, it gets settled very quickly. And so the frontier is going to die. Basically, what that means is the frontier is an unsettled part of land. If you've ever heard the final frontier, that's talking about outer space, because that's the only space left on the planet where absolutely nobody is living, in a place that they can live. Antarctica, we could exclude from that. But at this point, by I think it's like 1889, 1890, we do a census in the United States, and we find out that there's not a single single square mile of land in the U.S. where there is not someone living, or at least a couple of people living. And that means officially the frontier is over. And we can say for sure now that the United States is totally settled. So now we can get into more specifics about all of that discrimination and everything that I said has been going on for quite some time. So first we'll talk about African Americans. So we're going to see some major movement in terms of civil rights during the Gilded Age, not as much as we'll see in the next unit or in obviously the civil rights movement, but we're going to see some important people start to take the stage on the civil rights platform during the Gilded Age, who will really try to help things move along. Now, obviously, Jim Crow is just starting to be a thing in the South. Now that Reconstruction is over, segregation is starting to happen all over the place, and Jim Crow is happening, just sweeping across the country, and we are going to eventually segregate every single public facility in the South. So we're limiting voting rights. We talked about how we've limited voting rights in the past. The KKK uses violence and intimidation. Other groups do the same thing, but the law can also do it as well. Literacy tests, forcing people to take tests, but they wouldn't just be standard, like, let's make sure you know how to read. It would ask ridiculous questions that no one would know the answer to, and you'd have to take the test. If you would just get one wrong, then they would say that you're not fit. But if a white person came in, they would give them like the easy version of the test, and they would automatically be able to vote. Even some states said if you would be allowed to vote if your ancestor could vote prior to 1866, which basically just means if you're black, then you can't vote, because those are the only people whose ancestors weren't able to vote in 1866. So lots of this is happening all over the place. And this is really, really going to kill the black vote in the South. We talked before about during Reconstruction when there were so many black voters. By the time we get to World War II, only 3% of African Americans are actually voting in the South. And that is going to have some major, major long-term impact. I mean, when you look at voter turnout among African Americans today, it is significantly lower. Not necessarily because in the law we've written all of these discriminatory ways of stopping someone to vote. That's all, in terms of the law, that's gone now, and no one's at the KKK is not standing outside of a polling place anymore trying to physically stop people from voting. But now it's sort of like a generational thing that has set in, and we've sort of like taken away the desire and want, or the idea that your vote matters and that your voice matters. So we've really taken all of that away. Obviously, segregation is going to be a big thing. So this is when we're going to finally get into Plessy v. Ferguson. So during the 1870s, obviously the African American community and civil rights activists have been trying to fight segregation in the South, so they'll challenge segregation in the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which makes it to the Supreme Court, basically talking about, is it possible to have segregation and truly provide equality for all people? And this all revolves around the 14th Amendment, right? Because the 14th Amendment says that all citizens have to be equally protected under the law. So if we can segregate and still provide for people equally, then there's nothing wrong with segregation. But if segregation is preventing us from protecting people and providing them the same opportunities, then it violates the Constitution, and we have to get rid of it. And so the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate is equal. It is possible to have two separate facilities, one for white people and one for non-white people, and provide for those two groups equally. Is that realistic? Absolutely not. We've talked about that in the past, and we'll talk about that more in the future when we get to the civil rights movement. But Plessy v. Ferguson basically supports the idea of segregation in public facilities, specifically schools, right? And that's not going to turn around until 1954 when we get to Brown v. Board of Education. But we've got three people you see on the slide in particular who are going to be very important in terms of leading the civil rights movement for African Americans, but really just getting it started in the 20th century. These are going to be some very important people.